Thank you all for taking the time to attend this webinar today. I know there are no shortage of Zoom meetings or digital webinars that you could spend your time attending. So I appreciate you being here to chat about workforce engagement and retention. Now, before I pivoted my career into technology to found WorkStep, which is a HR software company, my job was to solve many of the same challenges that keep many of you up at night today. As a manager at a third-party logistics warehouse that was part of the broader Walmart supply chain, I was in charge of managing and retaining our frontline hourly workforce. Now, back then, the labor market was a little bit more, let's just say, balanced than it is today. But it's never been easy to find, motivate, engage, and keep great talent in-house, especially in organizations with large frontline teams. Based on those experiences, at WorkStep, we build software that helps HR leaders like yourselves improve engagement and retention of distributed frontline workforces, the deskless workers that keep our companies running and keep our economy moving. But we're not here today to talk about WorkStep. What we're here to do is to break down how any company can build an effective employee engagement strategy, understand their workforce turnover in a quantitative and direct way, translate that workforce feedback that comes from engagement into action, and ultimately become the employer of choice in their space. And that's what we're all here to do, right? If we can be an employer of choice in our region, in our industry, it decreases our cost per hire, it brings us higher caliber talent, it improves our productivity, and ultimately it improves the experience of our customers. So that is the end goal. So first of all, before we can understand our turnover, how we can act on feedback and ultimately improve, we need to be able to engage our associates. And for those of us that manage an HR group that deals directly with distributed frontline teams, right? These are workers in various restaurants or stores or hospitality establishments or warehouses or factories, right? We can't email them easily. We can't send them a quick Slack. We don't always work the same shift, and we often don't even work in the same location. How do we engage these distributed frontline workers who could work across the country or across the globe at different times and in different buildings than we do? Effective employee engagement is something that we hear all the time, right? Employee engagement is something that every HR leader talks about. It's a score that we get, right? It's oh, your engagement score dropped from 80 to 75. It's a category of software vendor. Oh, who is the best employee engagement tool for our specific vertical? But at the end of the day, employee engagement is all about connection. It's about connecting our leadership and our HR teams to our employee base. Why does it pain us so much more as parents when our own child falls off their bike versus the kid down the street? Why does it bring us so much more joy when our own child gets an A+ on their project versus a classmate? It's because we're connected to our family deeply. And what employee engagement attempts to do is to build that same sort of connection between employee and leader, between employee and manager, between employee and HR team, and between employee and the organization as a whole. So the goal of engagement is connection. And the result of building that connection with our employees is a business result at the end of the day. Now, connection might be, touchy-feely sounding, but ultimately it drives hard savings because employee engagement strategies, when deployed correctly, create a double bottom line opportunities for our organization. So not only does it help make our company a better place to work, a company that people enjoy working for, a company that helps our employees on a day-to-day business basis live a better life. But it's also good for business because more engaged employees are less likely to turn over. They're more productive. They have less safety incidences. Their morale is higher. And ultimately, they deliver a better customer experience, no matter what line of work we're in. And so when we are able to build effective engagement strategies, ultimately it's the employees who win, but it's also the company who wins. And speaking of improving the lives of those teams, employers with engaged teams win for all of those reasons, right? We have better employee well-being, better job satisfaction, happier employees, which leads to better customer experiences, which leads to a better environment, which ultimately leads back to better employee retention. The companies who have less engaged employees, therefore, are left behind. The employer of choice wins, and the rest of the companies are left competing for the less qualified or high caliber end of the talent spectrum. Creating this positive employee engagement starts with listening to our teammates. How we create a culture of feedback, how we show respect, how we increase transparency, how we improve our company as a place to work starts with our ability to receive feedback from our teammates in a structured way, in real time, and at scale. Everything that we do from an engagement strategy builds on this foundation of employee listening. If we are not able to collect, encourage, and act on feedback from our teammates, then we'll never have an effective engagement strategy. And unfortunately, today in this country, the United States, frontline workers, again, hourly workers who don't work in front of a desk on a day-to-day basis, are as a whole not being listened to. So again, at WorkStep, we provide employee engagement and retention software for large frontline teams. And so we are connected to hundreds of thousands, millions of frontline workers. And so we talk to them about what they're seeing, what they're feeling, and sort of how it's going from an employee engagement perspective. And 41% of frontline workers say that management never seeks their feedback. So now you might be thinking, oh, but that's not my company. But at a whole, as an industry, 41% of frontline workers feel management never seeks their feedback. 70%, so significantly more, feel their voice is not being heard. So they might get asked for feedback, but it's not clear that anybody is actually listening to what they have to share. And finally, and we'll talk a little bit more about annual engagement surveys later, 8% are only asked for feedback once a year. And especially in a world with high employee turnover, that's simply not enough. And the cost of that infrequent, often missing, and at times not listened to feedback system are high. So almost 9 out of 10, 90%, 89% of frontline workers are more likely to stay at a company that they feel both encourages and listens to their feedback. 2/3 want the opportunity to provide feedback to their employer and to those leadership teams at least once a month. And so frontline employees are begging to have the opportunity to provide their voice to their employers, to let them know, hey, here's what's going well. Here's what challenges I'm having. How can we work together to make this company a better place to work. And so what we need to do as HR organizations in partnership with our ops partners or business partners is we need to put the structures in place to give those teammates a voice, right? Annual surveys no longer are enough to engage our teammates. We need to be sure that we are collecting feedback, collecting sentiment throughout these employees' journeys. Because again, if we run an annual survey in October and populate results in December and share action plans in January, well, what about the employee who joined in April and quit in June? Isn't that the employee who we really want to hear from? And so we need to sort of rethink our annual and pulse engagement strategy. Think about more so how we align our engagement strategy with the journey of our employees so that we can understand their sentiment throughout their journey and ultimately be proactive about addressing any challenges that they might have. So first and foremost, we need to move from a world in which we're collecting feedback at just a moment in time to a world in which we are collecting feedback throughout an employee's life cycle with our company. Secondly, we need to make sure that we have all of the key stakeholders sharing one foundational truth around that employee listening and employee feedback strategy. We need to bring HR, operations, frontline leaders, and the C-suite to one place where there's one source of truth, and that is employee sentiment, employee voice, and employee feedback. Because if HR gets one set of data and one set of feedback and ops isn't privy to it, or ops leaders are meeting with employees directly, but HR is not in the loop, or feedback from employees is being filtered as it goes up the chain, we can't, as a leadership structure, work together to understand what are the most meaningful drivers of employee turnover, where are the places where we're not doing as well as we could be as compared to our peers, and what are our bets as a cohesive leadership team to make our company a better place to work. And so that starts with consistent ongoing check-ins that allow frontline associates to provide feedback throughout their journey that is shared in real time, objectively, without any sort of whitewashing or translation layer that allows every leader to understand here is what's happening with our employee experience. Here is what we are doing exceptionally well. Here is where our challenges are. Here is where that's changing from segment to segment or over time. And ultimately, what can we be doing to reduce turnover? Because as we all know, the rotating door of frontline workforce turnover has never been spinning more quickly. I mean, we've all heard about the Great Resignation. We're certainly sick of it. We're probably sick of even talking about it, right? But frontline workers in this country, or even just workers in this country, are leaving their employers at rates that we've never seen before. Quits are up about 2x since pre-pandemic, right? Or over the last 10 years, rather. So employees are leaving their jobs about twice as frequently as they ever have, or as they did historically. Hourly workforce turnover exceeded 57% last year, an all-time high. And so the cost of this turnover is massive, right? Lost productivity, cost of hiring and training, cost of forced OT, more safety incidences, decreasing workforce morale. And so when we don't address the employee engagement challenge, we don't know how to solve the employee retention challenge. And that is exactly where these roads connect in terms of engagement and ultimately the cost of turnover, right? Low engagement leads to more and more costly turnover, while employees who are engaged by teams like ours are more likely to stay and grow with our organization. Because again, workers, but especially frontline workers, are voting with their feet in ways that we've never seen before, right? These employees are taking ownership of their own careers. They have access to more flexible work alternatives than they've ever had before. They have access to the company across the street who might be paying more dollars per hour. And at the end of the day, with all of these options in the world, right? 11 million open jobs in the United States. The reason to stay with your company is if your company is investing in that worker as much as the worker is investing in the company. And the way that we make those two align is by starting with effective employee engagement strategy. And so from there, we can begin to build a picture of what's causing our employees to leave. Why is our turnover so high? As mentioned, WorkStep is a workforce engagement and retention technology platform. We automate this process of collecting feedback from our distributed teammates at scale at key milestones in their journey. We analyze that feedback to flag imminent turnover risk, but most critically for what I'm about to share is we tie that feedback to actual outcomes so that we can show leaders not just where employees, teammates unhappy, that's easy to sort of learn, but what exactly is driving people to quit, right? Like, what do the people who are leaving say and feel differently from those who are staying? And what we've learned is shocking for the most part. So, first of all, more than 3/4 of frontline workers are considering a job change in the next 3 months. So, next time you look out over your factory floor or workforce at an all hands meeting, imagine that 3 out of each 4 people that you set your eyes on are considering leaving imminently. It's a pretty scary thought. A lot of those are also new in their role. So not only are you losing a lot of people, but you're losing a lot of people that you just hired. And then finally, 3/4 rank career growth as the top reason they would leave. And again, this makes sense because there are so many opportunities available in the broader labor ecosystem. The main reason to stay where you are is because you believe the future where you are is brighter than the present. You believe that there's no reason to start over at a new company because there's growth ahead of you where you are today. And so across all of our customers and all of their employees, hundreds of thousands of employees, we measure what's actually driving people to quit at a macro level. And what we find quarter after quarter after quarter is that the career growth is the top driver of turnover for hourly workers. Said another way, employees who don't understand the growth pathways available to them at your company or at any company are the most likely to quit. Another thing that's often surprising is that pay actually only ranks 7th on the list. What we have found, and it holds up in other sort of experiments and analysis we've seen from other at-scale organizations, is that pay is a very, very, very powerful driver of talent acquisition, right? If you want to bring in more candidates and higher quality candidates, changing the hourly pay on your role is a very powerful tool. However, once somebody works for your organization, compensation is a very poor tool to drive retention. Yes, you need to be competitive, but more often than not, when an employee leaves your organization, it's not because you don't pay more. It's because they don't understand their career growth pathways. They don't either receive or have the opportunity to give feedback because they don't feel the job was aligned to their expectations that were set in the talent acquisition process, because they don't have the tools or equipment they need, because they don't feel safe, because the role is overly physical, or because there's something broken in the onboarding process. All of these themes drive more turnover statistically in frontline workforces than does pay. And so that is what drives frontline workforce turnover at a macro level. But what you want to know is what drives turnover for your workforce. So again, we're going to come back to this theme of feedback. Feedback is the number 2 reason under career growth that frontline workers are quitting their jobs today. And when we ask for feedback and actually listen to it, we have the opportunity to intercept that turnover before it happens, right? If we're able to collect feedback from that new employee who just reached the end of their first week, he or she is having a challenge with training or a challenge with pay or a challenge with safety, and we can hear, address, and then ultimately communicate back with that associate about that challenge, we can get ahead of turnover. If we can collect feedback from an entire group of employees and understand really what matters to them and what their challenges are in real time, and then set an action plan at the leadership level to address those challenges, we can get ahead of turnover. So everything that we do starts with that voice of the associate and then bridges to analysis of what's going on. And then it leads to us as leaders taking some sort of action that we intend to impact a result. And so what we help our partners with, but again, this is important outside of WorkStep's technology platform as well, is like, yes, we have to collect feedback from our frontline teams. Of course, we all know that, right? Yes, it should be frequent. Yes, it should be based on the milestones of their journey. But if we just collect and analyze that feedback and don't take action, we're not actually driving improved results, right? We're just sort of doing engagement for show. Acting on that feedback is essential. That's where we can have an impact. And so when we collect feedback from our associates, we need to have a strategy through which that is actioned, both on an individual basis and on a group basis, right? So if an employee is having a challenge with their manager or with their growth or with their leadership at their building, how do we address that on a one-on-one basis? Second of all, how do we take action at a group level, right? A particular challenge in a given facility or region. How do we get operations, leadership, and HR on the same page so that we can take action and then we can communicate that action to make our associates aware that we are in fact listening and that we are in fact here to help. And so there are a few different types of actions that we talk about, right? Again, we gave the example of like the new employee who's having a safety issue, right? That's a critical action that needs to be identified immediately and needs to be resolved. So the way our software works is we flag these sort of comments as alerts that leadership can then basically triage transparently and communicate back to the associate. So, for example, an associate says, I love my role so far in this warehouse, but there's broken pallets everywhere. Okay, how does that get routed to our head of safety? How do they go triage that situation with the broken pallets? How do they then communicate back to that associate and say, hey, we appreciate you speaking up. That issue with the broken pallets has been taken care of. Here's my direct line if you ever want to speak more about safety issues in the building. And, please do continue to keep that feedback coming. So that's the critical sort of type of action, is how we can get ahead of an individual concern that is time sensitive. Then there's also ongoing actions. So something that's a little bit more structural. So it's not just broken pallets on the floor once, but maybe it's like we really in this building don't follow our safety protocols. Okay, so then it's how do we as a leadership team get to the root of this ongoing issue, address it, and then communicate back with either that specific associate or the group of associates for whom that matters. Finally, there are localized or departmental challenges. So we have an issue with our receiving division or with our cashiers, and what can we do either in partnership with the head of that division or potentially, if that is the challenge, above that division to resolve that issue. And then finally, organizational. So we help companies understand where do you trail your peers, but more importantly, what is causing employees to leave your organization across the entire company? And what are the actions that you could take to get ahead of that turnover at a broad sort of company level? And we've already touched on this a couple of times, but I'll keep hitting on it because it's so important, right? What is the old saying? If a tree falls in the forest and nobody's around to hear it, doesn't make a sound. The same can be true for the way that we respond and action employee feedback, right? I think we've all, as HR leaders, had programs that we've launched where, we introduce a new benefit and it turns out very few people sign up. And then you get somebody in your office 2 weeks later and they're asking, hey, maybe we could have this benefit. And the answer is, oh, we already do. You just didn't know that, right? And so, when we receive feedback from our associates and we do something with it, either just acknowledge it or action it in some way, we need to close the loop, right? We need to make people aware. Not only are we listening, but you are right. Here's what we did. Please let us know how it's going, right? Like, we need to be able to make associates aware of the things we're doing to make them feel supported and engaged with our company. And so that's where this sort of virtuous cycle that we help companies follow comes into play. Again, we build software that helps companies automate this, but you can do this in a manual way as well, especially if you have a very small company. But collecting that consistent feedback, analyzing that feedback to identify imminent turnover risk from individuals, as well as understand what is driving workforce turnover at a group level, acting to address that feedback, whether it be critical or ongoing or organizational, measuring the impact of those actions so that we know what's working, what's driving better employee sentiment, what's driving lower employee turnover, and then ultimately the outcome of this process is better retention. And that was sort of a 1, 2, 3, 4 of what we do. But it really is this process as HR leaders with employee engagement. It's a loop, right? What we need to do is always be collecting feedback, analyzing that sentiment, taking action, understanding whether that works, making people aware of the action we took, and then starting back at the top, which is collecting feedback, right? Because if we did this initiative, if we made this investment, we want to know, is it working, right? And so there's this loop that is basically just collect feedback, analyze that feedback, take action, create awareness of that action, measure the result of that action, and go back to the start with collecting feedback. And by following this cycle, we as leaders, in partnership with business leaders and ops leaders, can drive real change because it functionally is a scientific process, right? We have a hypothesis, we take an action, we measure the result of that action, and we form a new hypothesis. And in doing so, we can continue to improve the outcomes of our frontline teams, but also the outcomes of our company as a whole. One final detail is that we also at WorkStep help our customers understand the actions they could take based on the challenge they're facing. So if you have a specific leadership challenge or scheduling challenge or safety challenge, there are best practices in your industry. So we want to help leaders understand, hey, what are other parts of our organization doing about this challenge, or what are other companies in our space doing about this specific challenge? So, as HR leaders, you guys all already know that employee engagement is important. You already know that identifying your turnover drivers is important. You already know that following a process to structurally improve employee satisfaction is important. But just to hammer it home, the reason why this is so important is because it's a candidate's market out there. It's an employee's market out there. The roles that you employ today, the roles that our company employs today, these people could go out and find work elsewhere. And so if we're not an employer of choice, if you're not an employer of choice, your cost of hiring goes up, your turnover goes up, your productivity goes down, your average morale goes down, and you're stuck with a really, really hard cycle to turn around. So it's no longer good enough to be an okay place to work. It's no longer good enough to treat your employees okay, right? Every single company needs to be an employer of choice. I mean, I think even if you look at two of the largest employers in the world, Amazon's a great example. Not famous for being an exceptional employer. But you know what they did in the last year? Because they needed to, is they changed their company mission from something along the lines of like being the world's most customer centric company to being the world's most customer centric company and best employer. The reason they did that is they knew that to achieve their mission of delivering for their customers, and I'm sure we've all ordered something from Amazon, they need to be able to recruit and retain talent at scale. And so it's that critical to their business operation that they become an employer of choice. And whether you're at Amazon's scale or not, it's equally critical for your company to be an employer of choice. And so our view is that the way that companies do that is by following this cycle of collecting feedback, analyzing that feedback, taking action, creating awareness, and collecting more feedback. But of course, there are also just like core strategies that can be employed along the way there as well. Of course, competitive pay and benefits helps. Meaningful work, especially in younger generations, people want to feel connected to the mission of what they're working on. What is their why? Are there strong leaders that can be emulated and followed within the organization? Is there that career development and career pathways? And is that known? Because we talk a lot to companies who are like, oh yeah, there's tons of growth potential. You know, this role can become that role. And oh, by the way, the head of this division started on the front line. But then you talk to the frontline associates and they have no idea. They don't know that their boss's boss had their job 3 years ago. They don't know that the company sponsors this training, right? They don't know what they could become because nobody tells them. Is there work-life balance? Is there a strong culture driven through engagement? And are that workforce acting as ambassadors? Are they proud of where they work? These steps allow any company to become an employer of choice. And so today, over the last 35 minutes, we've talked about how to build an effective employee engagement strategy, why engagement is so critical, and then also why, once a year or twice a year isn't enough for employee engagement. We've talked about what's driving frontline workers to leave their roles in the country at large, how WorkStep learns that, and how that might be different for your organization. We've chatted through really how your company can take the step from collecting feedback to actually actioning on that feedback, which allows that feedback to be valuable for the company. And then finally, what it means to be an employer of choice, why this loop of feedback and action can drive a company to be an employer of choice. And finally, why that's so necessary in this environment, right? Because an employer of choice ends up having a lower overall labor cost relative to productivity, which drives better business results, which drives more growth, which drives more opportunity for your teams, and the virtuous cycle up. So every single one of us wants to be an employer of choice in our specific space. Every single one of us wants to be a great place to work. What we have to do to get there is we have to empower the voice of our associates. We have to make them feel heard. We have to act on the things that matter to them. We have to continue to work in partnership with them to make our company a better place to work. By doing so, we not only help our company succeed in a competitive market, but we also improve the lives of all of the teammates who work with and for us. And with that, I will wrap up the presentation part, but I am available for any Q&A, and I see a few have come in. Is there going to be a prompt for the Q&A, or should I just start reading through the list?
Hey Dan, this is WebEx producer here. So we do have some questions. They are in the QA panel. Um, we can start with the first one if you like.
Sure.
So employee engagement is a hot topic in the industry today. At my company, we execute an annual survey. It seems like many companies are now considering more regular check-ins with their workforce. How frequently should that be and how?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I mean, we talked about how annual surveys are enough for sort of the obvious reasons that you're not going to get feedback from a lot of folks, and it becomes quite stale quite quickly. How many is enough? It really, for us, our point of view is that it depends on how long the employee's been with your organization. For your tenured workforce, people who have been there for 5, 10 years, even 3 years. Quarterly is about right in terms of making sure that nothing is changing, in terms ensure that you're collecting any issues before turnover events happen. For newer employees, where sentiment changes more quickly, where turnover events are more frequent, we believe that it should be much more frequent than that. So we, by default, partner with our companies to basically get weekly feedback at the very start, then monthly feedback for a while, and then transitioning to quarterly feedback as the employee base reaches maturity. In terms of how, we believe in meeting frontline workers where they are. So we partner with companies to help them distribute check-ins to their workforce either via SMS or personal email or kiosk, whatever is sort of natural within the flow of their what they're already doing is the best way to be able to capture feedback from those teammates who don't sit in their email all day like many of us.
Thank you for your answer. So it's interesting to see the growth. It's the top reason for turnover. Can you share a little more about this? You did mention that it has been in the top three consecutively. And do you think it will continue to trend even in a down market?
Uh, Personally, I do, right? I think that when we think about human beings, like let's forget about frontline workers, or HR people, or me. Like we all want growth and change. Now that means different things to everybody, but nobody wakes up and says, "I want my life and my job to be the exact same as it is today." Every day for the rest of my life. We thrive on that sort of glimmering thing on the horizon. And once we get it, we often try to find a new horizon. And so it's very human to want to understand your growth potential and your growth pathways. And yes, obviously the economy is on somewhat shaky footing right now, which could change overall worker preferences. But I firmly believe that we'll continue to see career growth as being the number one motivating factor for workforce retention.
Thank you so much for your answer. Great presentation, obviously. And thanks for sharing all of those great insights. So one question regarding feedback. Feedback is obviously very important and companies take it very seriously, but they do struggle with closing the loop with the employees. Any thoughts or suggestions on how to effectively do that? Collecting feedback from employees.
Yeah, so that's it's a really hard thing to accomplish without a technology solution like WorkStep. So the way that we do it is we distribute these check-ins that where workers provide feedback. Their feedback is anonymous or confidential. However, if a leadership receives a comment like, "Yeah, I didn't receive my paycheck, and I'm pissed off about that," we actually have software that in the background can allow leadership to follow up with that associate and ensure they feel heard, get a response message to the teammate without ever needing to sacrifice anonymity. So basically, the leader doesn't know who provided that feedback, but in the background, the technology sort of sends the leadership response to that associate. So that's a great way to make sure they feel heard. Of course, another way to do that is to do regular share outs, in break rooms or all team meetings in terms of, hey, thanks for all the feedback. Here's what we've heard. Here's the top three things we can work on, and here's what we're doing about them. At least that shows that the feedback's just not going in the trash can. And so, Technology can really be helpful on a one-to-one basis, especially with confidential feedback. But then, I mean, just best practices around ensuring that you're evangelizing the work that you're doing as it relates to workforce feedback is also critical.
Thank you. One question here that we have, how do you factor in the feelings of remote workers versus on-site?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is what we think about is in terms of understanding sentiment by segment. And so some of those segments might be remote versus on-site. A segment might be night shift versus day shift. A segment might be this role type versus that role type. A segment might be DEI segments, identifies as male versus identifies as female. And in every case, what we want to help customers do is understand the sentiment differences between groups, but also the turnover driver differences between groups. So, for example, if your remote employees are turning over because they don't feel connected to the company, but your in-house employees are turning over because they don't have good relationships with their managers or what have you, like you want to know what those differences are because the way that you attack those differences could be different by segment. So, for example, with one of our partners, we learned that employees identifying as female had 40% lower onboarding satisfaction, which led to much higher new employee turnover. And we were able to sort of unpack why that was in terms of representation in onboarding processes and really help them resolve that delta for that one particular workforce segment that they were curious about.
Thank you. Can you please share suggestions on how to hold leaders accountable for action planning following the survey? How do we get stories to report back to the business of change?
Yeah, so the way, in the old world, I feel like what everybody did is like, okay, the annual engagement survey went out, like every leader, please look at your results and set like one action plan and log it in this spreadsheet, and then we'll check back in 3 months. The way that it works with sort of agile software, like what we've built, is on an individual level, leaders can engage with those associates, and leaders above them can see who's engaging and who's not. So you can actually see if people are engaging with the feedback from their associates. Um, and B, logging more frequent, smaller actions. So here's this trend. Here's what we're doing about it. It's populated in the software platform. We can see how that impacted sentiment and turnover as a result. And providing that sort of like less rigid, more frequent, lighter weight way of saying, here's what I'm seeing, here's what I'm doing about it, and here's when we'll know if it's working or not.
Thank you. Let me see if there's anything else that I can see in the QA. 1 second, please, Dan. Okay, let's see. Yes, so I have a question here. Let me get that ready for you. So it has to deal with diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So the question here is DEI plus B is really important with every workforce. With frontline workers, do you outline specific cultural strategies for engagement and feedback?
Yeah, so first of all, from a DEIB perspective, one thing that we encourage all of our partners, really any organization, to do is leverage those slices when it comes to analyzing workforce sentiment, right? So one important thing is to understand for all of these various workforce segments, by age, by ethnicity, by gender, etc., can you understand the differences in sentiment and satisfaction and turnover? Because that could be really illuminating right off the bat to understand where, okay, you're bringing in diverse talent, but are you engaging and retaining that diverse talent? That's something that most companies aren't great about measuring today. Yeah, I think also depending on how you want to define this, you need to think about accessibility. So, for example, if a portion of your population maybe doesn't speak English first, either because um, they don't work domestically or they just don't speak English at home, how do you ensure that your engagement tools are accessible to them in their native language? That's something that, of course, we do by default, but obviously, a lot of engagement strategies can rely on translations as well in order to accomplish sort of accessibility for those engagement strategies. So I would say you want to understand, what are you trying to learn? Do you want to ask DEI questions? Uh, B, how are you going to analyze those segments? And then C, how are you going to make sure that your engagement strategy is accessible to your entire frontline team?
Thank you, Dan. I have one more question, and I believe this will be the last one. But one of the areas we have been discussing internally is how do we allow our employees to give feedback at any point in time? Have any of your customers figured that out, and how, especially how to do it effectively?
Yeah, so milestone-based check-ins are really important to get feedback at those key moments for each employee. But of course, you want to be open for feedback whenever anybody might have feedback to share. And so the way that we accomplish that is via what we call always on feedback mechanisms. So for example, providing customers with a QR code or kiosk they can put within their work facilities where employees can, scan at any time and just quickly write in what they're feeling in that moment. Now, of course, that isn't necessarily tied to the specific moment in their journey, but it provides sort of I provided feedback last week, but I have sort of one more thing to share. How do I do that? Well, there's a poster in the break room or an always open link where I can just go and provide that voice as well.